Welcome everyone to our Rutgers University Library's Open Access Week programs. I'm very happy to introduce everyone to Nick Shockey. He is the Director of Programs and Engagement at Spark, where he has worked since 2009. Nick works across Spark to identify areas to better support member libraries, co-leads Spark's communities of practice related to negotiations, privacy, and surveillance, and leads Spark students in next generation focused initiatives. Nick also contributes to Spark's policy advocacy and landscape analysis work, including authoring Spark statements opposing Clarovit's acquisition of ProQuest, Elsevier's acquisition of Interfolio, and commercial surveillance practices by academic vendors. So Nick, welcome again to our Open Access Week programs and helping kick off this week's programs as well. I really appreciate it, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tony. Always great to be with you all at Rutgers, especially since Rutgers has been, I think, such a leader in open access, particularly with Rutgers institutional open access policy, covering students in a way that many others don't. And since I originally, when I originally started at Spark, my role was really focused on building student and early career support for open access. So that particular defining aspect of Rutgers open access policy is very close to my heart. So wonderful to be with you all today. And happy International Open Access Week. I hope your Open Access Week is off to a great start, and that you all will have great discussions this week, continuing the conversation around community over commercialization, which is the theme once again this year. And the Open Access Week Advisory Committee that chooses the theme each year really felt that it was important to take the unprecedented step to repeat this theme for a second year in a row. Just given the importance and urgency around this conversation in the moment we're in, where it's really clear that sort of systems for research are in a period of transition, but what the outcome of that period ultimately looks like is still very, very much up in the air. So over the course of the 90 or so minutes that we have today, I'm hoping to sort of provide an overview of open access, sort of how we got to the current moment. Sort of the extent to which, sort of the way systems for open research are evolving do or don't reflect, sort of the commitment to equity, that was, sort of present at the beginning of the open access, or the push for open access and the Budapest Open Access Initiative, but is less present in many of the sort of dominant systems for open research that are taking hold. And then talk about sort of trends around sort of how the scholarly ecosystem is evolving, and some different opportunities for libraries and other community players in the space to really reassert control over research communication. So before I dive in, I also just want to welcome folks to ask questions or make comments at any point throughout the discussion today. I know that I think this will probably be a lot more fun for folks if it's not just me talking at y'all for sort of 60 minutes continuously and then having Q&A afterwards. So would love to sort of pause for any questions or to discuss any relevant experience that you all have, or any situations at Rutgers that are sort of responsive to parts of the presentation today. So with that, we can dive in earnest. So Open Access Week actually originally began a long time ago, well over 15 years ago now, as a national day of action for open access. And one of the sort of first Open Access Week activities that sort of ever happened, like during that first day of action, was that a group of students sort of took it upon themselves to raise awareness about the price of academic journals. And so they sort of printed out these little price tags and put them physically on the print copies of journals throughout the library. And I think it's, to me, a helpful jumping off point, just because sort of this issue of cost is really at the core of how sort of open access sort of started and evolved. As a response to the decades-long serials crisis of the prices of academic journals. So this next graph will be probably deeply familiar to all of the librarians in the room, but this is a graph from ARL showing the increase in expenditures on journal subscriptions over a couple of decades, ending in 2018, showing library spending on ongoing resource expenditures, essentially journal subscriptions, outpacing inflation, by 2 times over the course or over the time period pictured here. And that, has resulted again to something that's very familiar to the librarians in the room, which is just the incredibly expensive cost of academic journals. Each year the library journal does a periodical pricing survey, where they show the average cost per title across academic disciplines. So I you sort of update this slide each year and just see how much the prices just continue to increase year in and year out. And you can see, there are more than, there are 10 academic disciplines where the average cost per title per year, is well in excess of $2,500. So it's very easy to see when journals are this expensive, how quickly institutions have to start making difficult decisions about, what to provide access to through subscriptions and whatnot. And it's gotten to the point where others have started to take notice. I think one of the helpful sort of sound bites to this effect is The Economist magazine noticing sort of the profitability in the publishing industry and calling it, quote, a license to print money, which really speaks to not only sort of the price levels of academic journals, but how incredibly profitable some of the largest academic publishers are, with the largest academic publisher, Elsevier, often having a profit margin in the 35% range, which they've had year in and year out for well over a decade. The dynamics that are responsible for sort of these costs, the profit level for the commercial players in this space, are ones that will be familiar, I think, to probably everybody on this call, which is how so many of the inputs into this process are given voluntarily, right? So academic authors are not paid for their work. They often perform peer review for free, often serve as editors of journals, either for very little nominal compensation or no compensation at all. And then on the other side, libraries are forced to pay if they want access through subscriptions, whatever publishers are offering, right? The academic journals are not like other information sources like newspapers where there are reasonable substitutes, where if the New York Times becomes too expensive, you can just go to the Washington Post instead. Every academic journal, in a real sense, has a monopoly on the content that is published in that journal. You can't get that information easily somewhere else, and so that gives commercial players that own academic journals significant leverage to raise prices in the way that they have, year in and year out, multiples of inflation. And so, because of this sort of pricing pressure on the system that has been at unsustainable levels for quite some time, that led to the creation of sort of the broader push for open access, originally defined by the Budapest Open Access Initiative in 2002. And so when we're talking about open access, I think it's helpful to be really specific in the definition that we're not only talking about sort of the free, immediate online availability of scholarly research articles, but also that those articles come with full reuse rights. So you can not only read those articles, but you can also reuse them in any ways that you might want, such as translations or to feed articles into text and data mining analysis tools, for example, or with the rush towards AI, open access can make that subset of the research literature more available for analysis by AI-based tools, for example. There are generally two paths that are often sort of talked about, sort of to accomplish open access. There are open access journals that are, make all of the articles that they publish immediately and openly available online, such as, those published by PLOS. And then sort of the other large path towards open access is through self-archiving or posting the author's final manuscript or some form of an article in an institutional or disciplinary repository where it can be read by anybody, even if the final version of the article, the publisher's version, is behind a paywall. And a large proportion of journals and publishers will allow authors to make some form of their article publicly available, sometimes immediately, sometimes after an embargo. And open access is only one small, or not one small, it's only one part of sort of the broader open research or open science ecosystem. This is a graphic produced by UNESCO as part of the UNESCO recommendation on open science, where UNESCO member states collectively put vocalize their support for open research as core for the future of science. But I think this is helpful in just sort of depicting open access as one component of open research among sort of a much broader set of things like like open data, like open code. Other aspects of open science include ways to increase reproducibility, for example, or looking at open research infrastructure that goes beyond just open access publications. So because we're just talking about open access today, I'll avoid going into much detail on open research more broadly. But if folks have questions or want to get into sort of other aspects of open research beyond open access publications, happy to go into more detail there. So importantly, over the past well over a decade, there's been quite a bit of momentum behind research funders, and particularly public research funders, requiring the results of research they fund to be made openly available or publicly available online. As many folks on the webcast today may be familiar, in August of 2022, the Biden administration issued an executive memo through the Office of Science and Technology Policy, essentially strengthening the U.S. requirement for articles reporting on federally funded research to be made available immediately upon publication in a peer-reviewed journal, which replaces an older policy from 2013 that allowed for a 12-month delay. The policy also sort of strengthens language around making the data underlying publications openly available, and we also expect that these policies will touch on in some instances making code or software involved in the research. And on a little bit of a longer time horizon, these policies also include some updates requiring the use of persistent identifiers for articles and for authors. So there's clear momentum in the US around these policies with this 2022 policy where federal agencies have now largely all come out with plans. That the agencies that are covered by the memo have largely all come out with plans to produce policies responding to this memo. And now we're starting to see some of the final policies from these agencies come out. So we've seen that from the NIH, and are closely watching for other agencies that we expect to follow suit with those final policies in the coming months. And I think it's important to recognize, this isn't just, a priority at the level of the Office of Science and Technology Policy or at the federal agency level. It's a priority that goes up to the Office of the President himself. In 2022, right after the OSDP memo was published, President Biden himself actually spoke to the importance of open research in an address that he was giving that September, and tying it to his personal priority in the cancer moonshot, talking about the importance of transparency and that as an accelerant towards making progress in research. So I again think it's important to recognize that it's not just a priority within like part of the federal government, but that it's driven by the Office of the President. And looking out a little bit more broadly, this progress in the U.S. around this is in line with progress that's being made in other places. So similarly, the president of the European Commission has spoken about the centrality of the European Union's or European Commission's open research policies, in settings like at the World Economic Forum, for example. In Latin America, open access has long been central to the way that Latin American scholars approach disseminating their research results. And many ways, Latin America has been in front of places like North America and Europe, sort of in leading, and sort of leading with systems that are open for disseminating research results. And even sort of at the level of bodies like the G7 or G20, these bodies have also put out statements directly calling out the importance of open research in their discussions among science ministers that are part of those bodies, and talking about the centrality of open research as a core part of what research will look like within those governments. So lots and lots of progress, sort of at the government funder level towards open research. There's been similar movement by private foundations as well, and an initiative that Spark has helped to coordinate for many years now called the Open Research Funders Group brings together, I think now close to 24 private research foundations that have an interest in open research and work together to sort of improve and strengthen their own internal open research efforts for the scholarship that they fund. And I think this is a really important complementary component to sort of the public policy aspect of open research, that there are private foundations that are also sort of working actively to require the work that they fund be made publicly available. So sort of largely driven by these funder policies, and institutional policies like the one that Rutgers has. I think it's pretty clear that research really is becoming more open, that we are on a trajectory where research will become publicly available in some form. But I think as that's happening, it's really important to ask, is research becoming more equitable at the same time? Are we achieving the original vision of open access as an unprecedented public good? Or does it risk reinscribing some of sort of the challenges with subscription-based systems and biases of that system? So I think I won't belabor this point, but to the extent subscriptions are still with us in this transition, they're still incredibly expensive, and I think it's important to keep that in mind as a very real sort of barrier in this moment of transition for accessing and contributing to sort of the knowledge sharing process. But there's also a very real risk of replicating these same barriers that subscriptions create in new ways. And I think the highest profile example of that, and perhaps the most concerning example of that, are article processing charges, where instead of paying a subscription to access information, authors pay a fee to the publisher to make their specific article openly available. And it's one of a variety of different models. It's by no means a monolith in terms of business models for open access journals. There are many other business models, uh, you know, uh, diamond open access journals that don't charge anything to authors or readers, but find other ways to cover their costs. For example, or subscribe to open, which is a different model where the publisher commits that if a certain sort of subscription threshold is met, they will open up to anyone the contents of that journal. So you don't need a subscription to access it. So it's a way basically for publishers to sort of guarantee a threshold of revenue for maintaining that journal. And then once that's met, anybody can access the journal even without a subscription. So just want to pause to sort of show that there are other business models, but for APCs specifically, there's a real concern about how requiring payment to publish an article, recreates these kinds of, access barriers, but access barriers to publication rather than to reading. And, since the creation of APCs in the sort of mid 2000s, they've, increased significantly year on year. And so, even going back to 2019, what this graph illustrates is what the authors of this study described as hyperinflation in the market for article processing charges. So you can see over the period that this graph covers, they increased very significantly from 2005 to 2018 or so, in a way, again, that the authors describe as hyperinflation. But this graph only goes to 2019. Just a little bit later after the study was published, as some of you have likely seen, the journal Nature for the first time announced an open access option that was announced when a significant deal was struck between German institutions and Nature that sort of gave German authors access to publish in Nature open access. And as part of that, they opened up, or rather allowed people to pay APCs for Nature for the first time to make their articles openly available. And this APC was quite high. It was about 9,500 euros when it was first announced, or a little bit more than 11,000 US dollars to publish there. So sort of going back to this graph, you can see here on the y-axis that the APCs, the study only went up to 1,800 euros in that axis. So if you take this graph and try to plot that Nature APC, it looks like this. This is just sort of, you have to bear with me on it. I sort of tried to extrapolate the scale here, so it's not precise, but I think this visual is really helpful just in seeing how the cost of APCs is continuing on a trend that I think continues to be accurately described as hyperinflation. Right, this cost for publishing in Nature really does break the graph of a figure that was already describing hyperinflation, and it's unfortunately continued to get more expensive, right? So this was when the Nature APC was originally announced, I believe in 2020 or so. And right now, if you wanted to publish in Nature, that APC is a little bit more than 10,000 euros, or a little bit more than 12,000 US dollars. So again, you can see what the trend looks like here. And with costs like this, it's unfortunately not terribly surprising that researchers have estimated that globally we're spending somewhere around $2.5 billion per year on article processing charges alone. There's certainly some room. This is just an estimate that researchers at the Qualcomm lab have put together, but I think as an order of magnitude approximation, it's really helpful to sort of better understand just how much funding is going towards these APCs, and as an extension of that, how institutions should be thinking critically, about paying these or prioritizing, other means of making articles openly available. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I also just want to pause briefly to mention other types of fees that have started to be introduced, um, like the article development charge that was introduced by the American Chemical Society around this time last year, essentially as a fee for compliance with funder policies like the OSTP memo that require the author's final manuscript to be made publicly available immediately upon publication. Whereas previously many publishers allowed authors to deposit their articles in compliance with those policies, without having to pay a fee. This is an example of some publishers trying to force authors to pay a fee just to share their manuscript in satisfaction of those terms. And that's something that's caused a lot of concern across different library organizations, including Spark, but also the Council of Australian University Libraries, for example. So, cost and sort of how revenue is extracted, I think continues to be something that we have to watch really carefully as we transition towards open systems. But it's by no means the only aspect. As another example, there continues to be significant biases in representation across editorial boards. There's a great article I'm referencing here that was published during Open Access Week about 5 years ago, sort of showing the geographic skew of editorial boards, largely towards North America and Europe, with significant underrepresentation across Africa, Latin America, and Europe. And I think that's certainly an aspect that as we transition towards open systems, you should be watching closely to try to rectify these biases. Language barriers and language representation are another aspect to pay close attention to. And one way to sort of gauge that is the relative representation of different languages in places like the directory of open access books. For example, in this figure, sort of shows the heavy skew towards English language books, therefore surpassing other languages. So again, as we shift towards open systems, looking at ways to better ensure bibliodiversity and language representation in research communication, I think will be really important to achieving sort of those end goals of open access, not just to make things publicly available, but to advance the public good and address biases in the system. And then I think of particular relevance these days is the integration of AI into academic publishing and research communication systems. And I know it's a far higher visibility topic now than it has been in the past. But this isn't, and the concern around AI, isn't one that's new to just the past like 3 or 4 or 5 years. Going back to 2018, there were some concerns around the use of AI in peer review, and the way that AI systems could pick up on biases, for example, against authors that may not speak English as a first language, and start to learn biases related to that could replicate existing inequities in the system, but in ways that are even less transparent than they are currently. That set of concerns has continued. There's a fantastic article that came out 2 years ago called "The Perils of Artificial Intelligence in Academic Publishing," that was authored by the co-editors of an Elsevier journal that sort of document the different ways AI-based sort of tools were being introduced into their editorial workflow of their journal, and the ways that was concerning to them, and the way that the introduction of AI to, for example, suggest reviewers for articles might seem innocuous or might seem like a way to reduce the overhead for the editors, but to them it was actually really corrosive and undermining what the journal saw its work as doing and sort of cultivating a community. in an event that we hosted with the co-editors, they sort of unpacked this article a little bit more and talked about how, they really saw their journal as, a community for, for the academic discipline that they were serving. And, when they would get submissions that they'd send out for review, they felt it was really important to be intentional about how they selected reviewers. And they might, for example, pair a more senior scholar in their field with an earlier career scholar, both to give the early career scholar more experience, but also to represent sort of the evolving viewpoints in that discipline. And so when they talk about these automated systems for selecting reviewers, they were talking about how it seemed to be correlated with citations, for example, or seniority in a field, and not sensitive to the intentional choices that they were making as reviewers. And they sort of concluded by talking about how just sort of going with these automated processes would really hollow out the role that their journal was, sort of seeking to serve within its community. So, won't go into more detail there other than to really encourage you to seek out that article. I think it's a really, really important one in the current environment, given the speed with which AI tools are being integrated into the research workflow. And I think this is also a helpful point to pivot to talk about sort of on whose terms research is becoming open, right? One of the part of the way these three editors described their experience is that it felt to them like they were being experimented on, like these AI tools were being integrated into their editorial workflow without their consent, without them asking for it, and they were just expected to use them. And so I think it's indicative of these questions, of whose terms research is being made available on, and whose priorities do these decisions reflect. And this is something that Spark has been trying to follow really, really closely since, really starting in 2018. Spark's been working to sort of analyze the landscape of the academic publishing industry, and you better understand the evolution across that landscape, particularly with the largest players, and how those decisions and how that evolution were likely to affect academic libraries, academic institutions, faculty in the future, and with our roadmap for action, what actions faculty, libraries, academic institutions could take to better align that future with the best interests of the academic community. So I think these analyses, while they're a number of years old at this point, I think still provide a really good foundation, in understanding sort of the broader landscape, of academic publishing and research analytics in particular. And I think one way to talk about that is really important to unpack a little bit more is sort of thinking about the evolution of publishers, to not just existing at sort of the publishing step of the research lifecycle, but actually having products at different stages across the research lifecycle. So this is an illustration that was created by Alejandro Posada and George Chen at the University of Toronto Scarborough in collaboration with Leslie Chen, sort of creating a diagram of the academic knowledge production process from sort of discovery and the formulation of research question, to developing a manuscript, to publishing, peer reviewing that manuscript, sort of that research communication step, then to sort of research analytics and research evaluation and metrics, and even to not visualize here, but I think you can even think about like university rankings as like another step even beyond what's depicted here. But again, this is meant to represent sort of that research life cycle. And what Posada and Chan did was take this graph and then on top of it, sort of show the various, in this case, Elsevier products, that exist at each stage of that research life cycle. And actually, since this figure was produced, there have been more acquisitions in the space, which I've sort of added by hand here. But I think two acquisitions are particularly of note in this diagram: that of Interfolio, which is a faculty information system, essentially like enterprise software for academic institutions to run, review, promotion, and tenure processes, manage hiring processes. And I expect, many folks, especially if you've gone through like a hiring process, are likely familiar with Interfolio's products. And ResearchFish, which is another research analytics tool that Elsevier acquired in the last few years, that has some adoption with research funders, and I believe with some institutions as well, and better understanding impact of research. And why I think it's important to spend a bit of time on this graph is because once a vendor, once a company owns widely adopted products across different stages of the research lifecycle, it becomes possible for them to leverage those products, to sort of strengthen their position across the full research lifecycle. And that can happen at various stages in the research lifecycle, but I think, one that is maybe more intuitive than others is the ways in which owning a widely adopted discovery platform, that lots of folks use to access research articles, like, in Elsevier's case, Science Direct, can provide advantages in other aspects of their business. So if you own a discovery platform that, again, is widely adopted, gives you a lot of non-public information about, who is reading what articles, how they engage with those articles. So not just saying, things like, the number of times something is read or downloaded, but potentially having a sense of exactly who it is that's reading that article, and how they're engaging with it, whether they're, just loading the page and spending a few seconds there, or closely scrolling through the page, or using, share buttons or other functionality to share that with specific colleagues. And, when the same company that owns a discovery platform that can collect that kind of granular information also owns widely adopted research analytics tools or metrics products, it becomes easier to see how the kind of proprietary non-public data that you could collect through a discovery platform could then be baked into, new potential metrics products, right? It's easy to see the marketing pitch for like leading indicator metrics products that purport to capture, sort of advanced insights into impact before it becomes visible, to others. It might be possible to monetize, insights into, that could be derived from looking at exactly who is reading an article and how they're interacting with that article. To jump to a different stage of the research lifecycle, Interfolio is a faculty information system that manages review, promotion, and tenure processes. By its very nature, then has access to very, rich sets of non-public information, like, faculty activity reports, that describe activities long before they become visible in, published research results. And again, you could imagine, how when the same company also owns analytics products, metrics products, information that it has access to through something like a faculty information system, could be monetized in the analytics or metrics part of its business. And so because of, sort of this evolution from publisher into end-to-end research platform, I think it's really important to think about how this changes the relationship of researchers with, what they typically still think of as publishers, right? a single vendor owns widely adopted products across each stage in the research life cycle that they can use to advantage themselves at other stages of the research life cycle. I think it becomes more accurate actually to think of these entities really as intermediaries in the research process itself, rather than individual service providers. If institutions and funders rely on, proprietary, a vendor's products, to sort of understand, evaluate, make decisions, on research activities, and researchers rely on vendors to make their work visible to their funder, to their institution, then you can start to see how, that company sort of sits in the middle between different sides of, sort of the research communication ecosystem, and starts to play a role as, sort of a platform owner, in a way that starts to look a lot more like, an Amazon, which is an intermediary between, folks selling products and folks that want to buy them, or, Spotify, that serves as an intermediary between folks that want to listen to music and artists. And this is, I think, a concerning future for the open, this is a concerning future, I think, for open research, where, outputs might be nominally publicly accessible, but it's made accessible through proprietary platforms that then monetize data that's collected from users. And so, this is why, Spark has started to get a lot more focused on privacy. So those of you that have seen some of Spark's privacy work, like our Navigating Risk and Vendor Data Privacy Practices report from last year, focused on Science Direct, you might have wondered, like, why are the open research folks focus on privacy these days? And this evolution from publisher to platform really is why, because the monetization of personal data is sort of the lifeblood of these platforms, and sort of what allows them to leverage different stages in the research process, like the discovery layer or like faculty information systems, to their benefit, and in other places, like in the metrics business. And so by better understanding the privacy practices and policies of the largest vendors, we can get a better sense of, sort of what may be taking place behind the scenes, and action to protect privacy can also help mitigate some of the risks, of the rise of these research platforms. And so, what the sort of top line findings from this Science Direct report published last November, was that user tracking that would be unthinkable in a physical library setting now happens routinely through publisher platforms. And the report unpacks, sort of why that is in a variety of ways, and sort of why Science Direct in particular's data privacy practices undermine library privacy standards and guidelines. So the lead author of this report, Becky Yos, really documents, each of these findings in the report, and those include, the use of web beacons, cookies, and other invasive surveillance methods to track user behavior outside and beyond the Science Direct website. The extensive collection of a broad range of personal data from Science Direct, combined with personal data harvested from other sources beyond Science Direct, the collection through Science Direct of personal data by third parties, and the disclosure of personal data to other Elsevier products. So again, that's getting at sort of that connection between different Elsevier products at different points in the research lifecycle, and the potential for disclosure of personal data to other business units within Elsevier's parent RELX, including their RELX's risk products and services sold to corporation, governments, and law enforcement. And so, I think this report was really helpful in just documenting, that very granular collection of personal data and the permission structure created through Elsevier's policies to allow it to leverage that data that's collected through other business lines within Elsevier, and concerningly within other RELX entities, like its risk business, which I won't have time to get into, but happy to talk about RELX's risk business if it's of interest to folks. But of course, it's not just Elsevier. We just released an analysis of SpringerLink in the last few weeks that uncovered, in many ways, similar concerns, though they look slightly different in the case of SpringerLink. And to be specific there, what our analysis uncovered is that SpringerLink has 200 third parties that are allowed to collect information through the SpringerLink website, including companies that are also involved in data brokering, for example, and that the SpringerLink privacy policy sort of defers to these third parties. Data privacy policies for information that they collect. So, when information is collected by these third parties, it's those third parties' privacy policies that sort of control what can or can't happen with that data, rather than SpringerLink's own. Which means that to actually understand what would happen, to understand what might happen with data collected through SpringerLink, you'd have to read the privacy policies of all 200 other entities that are allowed to collect information through the SpringerLink site. And if those policies were about the same length as SpringerLink's, the amount of reading that would be required would be about the same as reading the entirety of George R.R. Martin's Song of Fire and Ice series. So at an average reading speed, that would be about 3 whole weeks of just reading privacy policies. Again, assuming those 200 third parties have a privacy policy of similar length to SpringerLink. And for more than 10 of these, you actually couldn't access their privacy policy because the link is broken. So I think there's a strong argument that it's actually impossible to meaningfully consent to these terms when you can't access the terms through which you're bound by with these third parties. And so the top line sort of finding from this analysis was that SpringerLink provides a case study in the encroachment of the broader surveillance-based data brokering economy into academic systems. I think a core sort of concern, I think, for libraries here is a lot of the entities that collect third-party entities that collect information through SpringerLink, while some are data brokers, that are concerning in and of themselves, many others participate in like online ad marketplaces, that use information for quote unquote personalized advertising. And while that may seem relatively innocuous, it really can compromise significantly the privacy protections that libraries work to put into place. So, we might think of the kinds of information that could be shared in these ad marketplaces, as transient and just used, to serve an ad. And for some entities in the marketplace, that is likely probably true. But there's also well-documented instances of data brokers sitting in these ad marketplaces and just hoovering up all the data, including entities that serve government, serve intelligence agencies, that sit on these ad marketplaces and collect, the information that flows through as, a source for, additional ends. And so I think it's really important for libraries to closely follow the potential for these kinds of tracking tools to compromise, reader privacy, again, in ways that would never be acceptable in a physical setting, but that there's real risk maybe happening online. It's not just Spark that's paying attention, sort of to these concerns around privacy and sort of the evolution of publishers into platform businesses. The International Science Council, has flagged this as well, talking about the risk of science knowledge platforms, risking the public interest mission in research. And a report that they released a few years ago called Opening the Record of Science. The German Research Foundation has made sort of similar points in a report that they put out a few years ago in 2021, talking about how these kinds of research analytics products based on the collection of personal data can fundamentally contradict academic freedom and informational self-determination. So I think this evolution of publishers into platforms is really important to sort of have in mind as we're thinking about sort of the evolution of systems towards openness. And to close, I want to talk about sort of ways that we can, instead of prioritizing sort of commercial interests, put equity at the core and prioritize community over commercialization, and how we can be intentional about doing so. And I think really to accomplish this, having community-owned, community-governed infrastructure will be critical. And so it's fantastic to see movement in this direction. So, for example, the UNESCO a few years ago released the UNESCO recommendation on open science that I alluded to briefly at the beginning of my presentation. That calls on member states to take a whole host of actions, but one of which, importantly, is to support non-commercial research infrastructure, and talking about the importance of non-commercial research infrastructure, for achieving the public interest mission of research. In addition to UNESCO, increasingly scholarly societies and organizations representing national academies have come out, talking about the importance of putting equity at the center of efforts to achieve open access, like this statement from ALIA that represents European research academies, again calling for equity to be put at the core of the shift towards open access. In the U.S., the AAAS has made sort of similar statements calling on academic institutions, other scholarly societies to go beyond paying lip service to the importance of equity in open, but really walking the walk. And for example, achieving open access publishing without placing the financial burden of publishing on authors. So, for example, speaking to the AAAS commitment to allowing authors to comply with the OSCP memo in making their work immediately available without paying any AAAS own journal. Similarly, we've seen some heartening progress on sort of incentive reform in aligning research incentives with open access. Over the last 5 years, there's been a series of roundtable discussions hosted by the National Academies of Science that Spark has been active in, around aligning incentives towards open research, that have been making progress sort of step by step, and sort of building the will to change, to update promotion and tenure policies at institutions to avoid being a barrier to the open sharing of research. And there's a relatively recent development here that I think is heartening, where the National Academy's recently released strategic plan through 2028 directly calls out the importance of catalyzing the transformation of the professional reward system in research, to go beyond just publications, or publications in prestigious outlets, to a much wider set of output or ways to recognize impact. And that transition to a more diverse set of indicators would go a long way to supporting transition towards communicating research openly. And again, this is something that Spark has been working to support through our Helios Open Initiative, which brings together higher education leaders across the U.S. to sort of share their experiences, and trying to walk the walk in changing evaluation systems to support open research. Within libraries, there's also been significant movement in this direction, to support community-owned infrastructure, or at least try to use library spending to better align research systems with the best interests of the academic community. So we've seen a number of statements like this one from Neural, setting out sort of a set of principles for academic publishers, like transparency, like equity, that are priorities to Neural when negotiating on behalf of their members, or when they're negotiating individually as individual Neural member institutions. And similarly, the Orbis Cascade Alliance has published a commitment to open principles and practices to help guide sort of their collections decision making as a consortia about what publishers or what types of opportunities to support and what to walk away from or minimize in their collections work. And this is also translating to the individual library level as well. We've seen a number of libraries start to put together sort of values-driven frameworks for evaluating licensing agreements, like this one created by Scarlett Galvin, who was at the time at Grand Valley State University, sort of mapping different library and institutional values and priorities against what was being offered by various vendors or various publishers. And we've also seen an increasing number of libraries make decisions about which publishers to support and how, sort of based on their alignment with the best interests of the academic community. Perhaps most notably, MIT in 2020 made the decision to go completely out of contract with Elsevier and cut all Elsevier titles. And they've remained out of contract, to today. And actually, MIT, along with a handful of other institutions that have left big deals, were highlighted in this ACRL Spark forum that we hosted last month, showing how, even outside of big deal packages, or even without any subscription to particular publishers at all, libraries were still able to maintain access that their institutions needed to that content using other means like ILL, like leveraging open access or publicly available copies, or in some instances using on-demand purchasing to fulfill need where somebody needed access immediately. But these institutions found, sometimes to their surprise, the willingness of their campus, to sort of happily rely on things like ILL or publicly available copies, that allowed them to recalibrate their spend in a way that was much more aligned with their values. And Spark maintains a cancellation tracker documenting libraries that have left big deals, either unbundling or going out of contract altogether. And to complement this resource, we also have a set of profiles on these institutions that sort of walk through in more detail exactly what it looks like to sort of prepare for analyze subscription packages, to sort of identify ones that may be good targets for unbundling, what that preparation looked like in terms of communications with campus, what actually carrying out that unbundling process looked like, what sort of other means of access were provided, and how those were communicated, and any other advice that these institutions would offer. So I think a number of different ways that the libraries can sort of walk the walk, aligning spend with sort of the academic community's best interests. Another, I think, important intervention here, aligned with other public policy efforts that Spark's engaged with, are regulatory interventions around open research systems. So what you'll see here on the screen are two submissions that Spark has made challenging mergers in this space. We've raised concerns around the acquisition of ProQuest by Clarivate, for example. We also raised concerns around Elsevier's acquisition of Interfolio. And as regulatory bodies like the Federal Trade Commission and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in the U.S. Sort of look at concerns related to commercial surveillance as a business model, I think there's a real opportunity to flag where that's starting to happen in the research and education space, and better educate regulators, about the need to follow, sort of what's happening in research and education closely, and considering actions that protect, the public mission interest of research and education. Then finally, we're starting to see shifts in publications themselves and the sort of steady trend of editorial boards resigning en masse, leaving commercial players, and sort of founding their journal, with a new publisher and in a way that more directly aligns with their interests. So this is, something that's been happening for well over a decade or two. But there have been a number of particularly high-profile examples, like the journal Lingua in 2015, whose editorial board resigned to start the open access publication Glossa. Over the last 18 to 24 months, there have been a number of high-profile similar cases, like the journal Neuroimage, the journal Critical Public Health, that left Taylor and Francis. Another journal in political philosophy, a journal called Design Studies. This is just sort of a sampling of some of the higher profile instances where editorial boards have resigned and sort of taken the control that they have in the system, to start, or not to start, but really to sort of transition the community that had been built around, sort of their journal that was published by a commercial player whose interests different from their own, and sort of take that community to a new journal where they could align the practices of that journal, with the best interests of the community. So often, having no article processing charge or a much lower article processing charge than what was previously being published. And then finally, I think the continued momentum of Diamond open access publications is another really positive indicator in this space. And there'll be a summit coming up in a couple months in Cape Town that'll bring together sort of the global Diamond community to sort of continue the momentum there. But we're seeing an increasing number of journals publish without a fee to authors or to readers. I think this is an area where Spark is active in trying to continue to cultivate and support the global Diamond community, and ensure that it evolves in a way that is sort of best suited to the individual constituencies that these journals serve. So sort of in closing, I know this presentations touched on a lot of sort of the challenges or sort of concerns and the evolution of sort of the research environment, but I hope this last part has given you a sense of the various different intervention points, and I think to me that is heartening, that there are real levers, for libraries, for academic institutions, for researchers, for policymakers, in the system that can change the trajectory, of how, systems for communicating research are evolving. And libraries really do have a core role to play in that. Whether that's, in education, like educating faculty on these issues as they emerge, and better aligning, collections spend with the best interests of academic institutions, or in, supporting, values or community aligned open access publishers, or as publishers themselves, with the increasing number of libraries that have library publishing programs, many of which use, a diamond model for library published journals that don't charge anything to authors or to readers. So I think that is more than enough talking at you all, and would love to address any questions or comments that folks have.
So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to use the chat. I will read them aloud to Nick, or if you would like, you can raise your hand and I will figure out how to unmute you so that you can go ahead and ask your question to Nick. I can probably ask a question while we're waiting for attendees to ask something too. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things Spark has done regarding open data as well?
Yeah, I think it's I think so. I guess to start, I would say probably one of the most active areas for Spark around open data is around the implementation of the OSTP
Mhm.
memo and its predecessors. So when the original 2013 um, Holder memo from OSTP was published, we collaborated with some others to produce a resource to better surface the research data sharing requirements that federal grantees would be bound by, which you can find at researchsharing.sparkopen.org. There's a sort of a companion resource focused on article sharing policies, but I think a core priority for us has been around sort of surfacing these federal requirements as they come online. So with the 2022 OSCP memo, we will be closely analyzing the final funder policies for their open data requirements, and we'll be updating that resource that I mentioned after those policies are the final versions of those policies are published, to better surface the sort of salient, the core aspects of those policies, like when data has to be made available, like what kind of data, where does it have to be made available, under what terms. But I think that's really a core area for us of supporting Spark member libraries and and authors on campus, and sort of understanding what those requirements are, and complying with them as easily as possible.
Yeah.
Uh, there's a tremendous amount of work around open data in terms of sort of like open data repositories, or building out infrastructure around
Yeah.
open data that sort of is beyond Spark's remit, and sort of the building of research infrastructure, though it is something that we are supportive of, particularly again those community owned or community governed open data repositories. Um, um, I think there's a whole ecosystem around supporting things like research data management plans, where there are others that are sort of helping to support libraries and researchers in complying with those policies,
Yeah.
uh, um, but that are already well served by what's happening by others in the community. So when we're looking at sort of what work Spark should prioritize, we're always doing that analysis of where are there sort of unmet needs within the Spark member library base, where we're uniquely well positioned to support them, and where there are others that might be best supported by sort of other players. And so that's maybe a little like of the behind the scenes analysis of why Spark's open data work sort of has focused in these areas, or in areas like supporting incentives reform to better reward the open sharing of data, rather than some of the work around like infrastructure, for example, that that we view as being best handled by others that are uniquely well positioned.
Sure. Does anyone have any questions you'd like to ask Nick while we have him available? Um, I do see a question come through. Uh, it seems that there were many attempts to protest Elsevier's high prices, but somehow its revenues are higher every year. It's like putting sanctions on Russia. The publishing business is expensive, and the funding must come from somewhere. How do you see the researchers slash libraries could work together to make publishing open access feasible financially? And it looks like Europe may be doing better in that regards.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question, and it touches on a lot of things. So I'll try to respond with some concision. But to use the last point as a jumping off point, I think um, it's interesting to compare the approach that's happening in the U.S. and what's happening in Europe. From Spark's perspective, uh, we are very supportive of the the federal government's approach that's a repository focused policy that requires deposit in repositories rather than sort of mandating that publications be made have to be published in open access journals. That's a bit different than some of the other policies. And I think there's certainly been progress in Europe over the last 5 years. That's often been driven by large national level open access agreements that have been signed and that not only cover the cost of accessing particular publishers publications, but also allow covered authors to publish in those journals without additional fee in some cases, or subsidize them in others. And while that has increased the number of open access journal articles, arguably, I think it comes at the cost of realizing the sort of equity component that open research can accomplish, because that kind of a structure ends up sort of further cementing the control of the largest academic publishers. There have already been studies showing how for authors that have agreements that that cover their publication costs, so they don't see a publication cost, that's affecting their decisions about where they publish. So those large commercial players that have these deals are starting to see a larger proportion of articles published with them by authors that are covered by those. So it's a driver of consolidation, and I would argue also a driver of increased cost. So getting back to your point about sort of high prices and revenue, I think these open access agreements can make it really difficult to reduce the really high costs that are in the system, because it accomplishes the shift to open access on the publisher's terms, by basing what we're paying them on often basically historic spend, and then often an additional fee on top of that to cover the publication. I mean, I hesitate to speak so broadly because there's a lot of heterogeneity in these different open access agreements and the prices that folks are getting, because it's not a monolith. There are agreements like this that have actually seen some price reductions, but I don't think that those are representative of the types of agreements that are that we've seen being struck. So I don't think that it is a real solution for addressing cost or the cost structure, or the sort of the balance of power between different players in the ecosystem. And what I think the OSDP memo can help accomplish, is really putting productive pressure on the system, by specifically requiring that an author's manuscript be made publicly available, and ensuring that there's a no-cost compliance option available to authors to deposit their article in a federal repository. And I think you can see how that those kinds of policies, coupled with libraries starting to make different decisions about how to allocate collection spend, to no longer pay for subscription based on historic spend, but to move away from bundled packages, use other means to provide access, and then critically reassess whether it makes sense to re-enter larger deals but at a different price point, or to continue providing access, outside of big deals or even outside of subscriptions altogether, but in a way that really puts libraries in control of what their spend is, and opens up space for libraries to deploy collections funds and with flexibility to support those publications, those parts of the research infrastructure that are aligned with libraries' values, with the best interests of the academic community. I could go on, but I will pause there and see if there you have any follow-up questions. Are there any aspects of that you'd like to delve into a little bit more deeply?
Another question came in. How can open access be called community-based when its point is to make the academic research open available globally for any platform to use for profit or surveillance?
So I think so first let me maybe unpack the term like community-based or community aligned. And I think um, at the core of like sort of these terms that I've used to some extent interchangeably, I think the most important aspect is that there's community governance of these platforms that, in the way that, an open access publisher or a piece of research infrastructure is organized, that, its decision-making body, like its board, the group that's ultimately responsible for, that project or that resource, is governed by the academic community, that its governance reflects the academic institutions, right? That they have participation of academic libraries or researchers, of other structures that firmly align, sort of like the fiduciary responsibility of the board, of the governance of that entity with the academic community's best interests. So using that as sort of a differentiator, you can see the difference between commercial entities, particularly publicly traded ones, who have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize profit for shareholders, and other types of entities, often non-commercial, that have boards that are comprised of members of the academic community, or have governance structures that firmly align themselves with advancing research or with the best interests of the research community rather than maximizing profit. I think those things are, they, I don't want to overly simplify to like, non-commercial good, commercial bad, because there can be really community-minded commercial players. And the same way that there can be nominally non-commercial entities or nonprofit entities that behave in ways that are actually quite similar, to the largest commercial players. But I think it's, sort of that governance piece and its effectiveness, that's that core differentiating factor to look at really, really closely. So, for that to answer your question about sort of openly available, research being used on platforms that are for profit for surveillance. There's this really interesting intersection, or way that sort of open access, in the sense of like full reuse rights, open access can help to provide a real way to address surveillance systems. So, if you think about articles that are just free to read, for example, like, articles that might be freely accessible on a publisher website, but not openly licensed, you can't host those articles anywhere else. So while you might be able to access them for free, it would be a violation of copyright to download that article and make it available through a different platform. Whereas if an article is openly available with full reuse rights, it's possible for that article to be hosted in an institutional repository or in, any other type of platform outside of the publisher's platform, that, where there's an incentive to surveil users and monetize personal data. And so, the, strong full open research policies, or, making articles fully open access, can be a hedge against surveillance systems by enabling the distribution of those articles in through other channels that respect user privacy. So I hope that's a helpful like clarification, sort of the ways in which openness can be, one way to address concerns around privacy and user surveillance. Again, that was like sort of that question touched on a number of things. So happy to take a follow-up if I didn't fully answer the question asked.
For either question asked, if there's a follow-up you'd like me to bring up, please feel free to share. I'll give it another minute if you're okay with that, Nick.
Yeah, of course.
Well, I'm not seeing any new questions. Oh, wait, there is a follow-up. Um, it just seems that the community governance is more about compromising rivals of the large tech platforms or publishers, and less about preventing profit and surveillance. Um, do you have any thoughts on that one? Comment, Nick?
Yeah, if I'm understanding it correctly, I think, yeah, I think these things they're intertwined, right? That the priorities of sort of the owners of platforms or publications drive the way that these systems evolve, and so sort of that fiduciary responsibility to maximize profit is what creates pressure, right, to adopt surveillance-based business models to not only accept the revenue from subscriptions or in an open environment through APCs or other payments for open access, but to layer on yet additional revenue opportunities, right, by monetizing personal information. For example, for both of the publishers we produce reports on, we don't know in what ways the collection of personal data is being monetized. And there are plenty of ways that personal information collected through publisher platforms could be monetized without a technical sale happening, but there could be an exchange. Other kinds of exchanges of value where publishers get access to certain tools or resources they wouldn't otherwise have access to. Uh, earn revenue in other ways, but that are not directly from the sale of data, but revenue opportunities like personalized advertising that are dependent on the use of that information. And so, I keep coming back to community governance, and really effective community governance as an important differentiator, because if that exists, then that entity is critically engaging with, like, just because we can monetize this thing, like, should we? Is it actually aligned with the best interests of the academic community? And I think again, there are ways that there can be commercial for-profit entities that still take to heart the best interests of the academic community. So it's not just a totally between for-profit and nonprofit. I think governance really is at the core. Um,
And then follow up from the other initial question. It's a lot to think about because we also have pressure from institutions for faculty to publish in high impact journals. And the faculty are reluctant to publish in open access journals that may not have that high of an impact in their specialty.
yes, yeah. And I think this is exactly, well, let me say, so I think that's exactly right. Like, you have to respond to the actual like pressures that are on faculty. Right. It doesn't help to try to push open access journals if that's not what they need or feel that they need to advance in their field, for promotion, for tenure. And so that's why Spark has been so active in organizing things like the National Academies Roundtable on aligning incentives for open research. It's why we have helped to catalyze the Helios Open community for higher education leaders to connect with one another around changing incentives internally that are in alignment with open research. And so, what that means is moving away from, prestige as the core, sort of reward mechanism and in the academy, right? In that earlier slide that I showed, highlighting the National Academy's strategic plan, right? It was calling out, sort of the need to move away from prestige as the, sort of core reward structure into a much more diverse set of rewards. And so, I think starting the conversation with faculty about the ways in which there's movement away from prestige, or yeah, prestige-based reward structures and toward other ones by entities like the national academies, or collections of university leaders through Helios Open, can be helpful in sort of starting that conversation. And if they're open to it, there's also lots of resources out there about how problematic journal-based metrics are, about how how at its core it's a logical fallacy to judge the impact of an individual article by the container in which it's published. If you think faculty would be open to those discussions, but I recognize that's definitely a judgment call. And that might not be the most productive intervention at this point. But I think it will take time to change those incentive structures, but I think there's room for optimism because of what's happening at the national academies level or among university leaders and and through Helios Open.
Well, I think we're out of time. But Nick, I want to thank you so much for presenting and helping kick off Rutgers University's Open Access Week programs. And if people are interested in more, they can visit you online at sparkopen.org. They can also email you at nick@sparkopen.org as well. We do have additional programs that are available later this week. They'll begin again on Wednesday. We couldn't get something scheduled on Tuesday, unfortunately. But folks are more than welcome to register for the other upcoming events scheduled later this week. We hope you'll be able to attend. And Nick, once again, thank you for taking the time to speak with everyone. I'm sure those who were able to attend live benefited, but we will also have this available on the Rutgers University Library's YouTube channel and shared throughout as well. So thank you all.
Thanks so much. It was great to be with you all to kick off Open Access Week.
Have a good day.
Bye, everyone.